A hush falls over the empire's heart, though no silence has ever been so loud. Behind the towering marble gates of the palace, a strange glow seeps out into the night, staining the cobblestones with the colour of dying embers. The city sleeps, in shadows, but inside those walls, a darkness thrives. Not the kind that hides in corners, but the kind that demands to be seen. Whispers move like snakes through the alleys, that the emperor, once draped in robes of authority, now surrounds, himself with bodies rather than subjects, turning his palace into a theatre of indulgence and corruption. But beneath the gold and velvet, beneath the laughter that echoes like broken glass, lies something far more sinister, a secret soaked in blood, humiliation, and the twisted hierarchies of race and power. This is not the story of an empire at its height, but of one rotting from within. An empire where the oppressed are summoned not as citizens, but as entertainment, where the emperor's thirst is never quenched, and where cruelty wears the mask of pleasure. And when the night's orgies end, only silence remains. A silence heavy with the cries of those who cannot speak. The palace, they say, is alive. Every wall remembers. Every floorboard trembles with the weight of what has been done. And every whisper leads back to one chilling truth. When power becomes hunger, humanity is devoured. The empire stretched wide like an endless wound, glittering on the surface but festering underneath. To the outside world, it was a symbol of wealth and civilization, its banners painted with gold, its armies feared for their discipline. But those who lived beneath its shadow knew the truth. Every stone of its palaces was laid on the backs of those stripped of freedom. Every banquet was seasoned with the salt of stolen sweat, and every law was carved to protect only those who resembled the emperor's own reflection. At the empire's centre stood the palace, a sprawling labyrinth of marble and jade. From afar it dazzled the eye, fountains that sang, gardens that bloomed even in winter, endless corridors polished, until they gleamed like mirrors. Yet up close, the shine was hollow. The gardens masked the cries of chained gardeners. The fountains were stained with the blood of those who fell beneath the whips of overseers, and the corridors whispered with footsteps of servants whose names were never remembered. The emperor himself was a man consumed by appetite. His portraits, spread across the empire, showed a noble figure draped in silks, his skin pale, his crown heavy with jewels. But behind those painted eyes lived something hungrier than power. An obsession with ownership, not just of land, not just of wealth, but of people. He believed that to rule was to possess, and possession meant nothing was off limits. Bodies, histories, entire generations. The palace was divided, not by its architecture, but by blood. In one wing lived the emperor and his courtiers, bathed in perfume and gold, their laughter spilling late into the night. In another, hidden from guests and dignitaries, lived the enslaved. They came from distant shores, from conquered lands. Their skin marked them. Their accents betrayed them. They were the hands that kept the empire alive. Feeding, cleaning, serving, yet never belonging. For them, the palace was not marble, but chains. It was in these hidden wings that the truth of the empire could be felt most deeply. The walls, sweated with despair, every surface scarred by quiet resistance. The enslaved whispered stories to one another in secret tongues, clinging to fragments of home that the empire tried to erase. They told tales of rivers that once belonged to them, of songs forbidden in the palace but alive in memory. And in the silence after, they wondered how long before even memory was stolen. How long before they became nothing more than nameless, shadows swallowed by the emperor's hunger. The city outside mirrored the palace. Streets were neatly paved near the markets where the privileged shopped, while just beyond those borders, alleys decayed into filth. There were inns where travellers of pale skin were welcomed with wine, while darker travellers were watched with suspicion, their presence questioned as though existence itself were trespassing. Guards patrolled, not to protect the weak, but to remind them of their place. Every gate, every law, Every ritual was designed not for justice, but for division. And yet, there were cracks in the illusion. The emperor's indulgence grew harder to disguise. At night, strange music echoed from the palace, mingling with screams quickly silenced. Carriages arrived carrying people who never returned. The city learned not to ask questions, but questions rotted in silence, and rot has a way of spreading. Within the hidden halls, there was one figure whose presence carried a weight heavier than chains. They were not noble, not powerful, not free. Yet their story would thread itself through the emperor's decay. Unlike others, they did not bow in spirit, even when forced to bow in body. Their eyes held the memory of freedom. Their hands carried the strength of generations, and their silence was not submission, but survival. The emperor had noticed, not the way one notices a person, but the way one notices an object that stands out in a collection. To him, this figure was not human, but a challenge, something to bend, to break, to claim. For in his palace, everything eventually became his, whether through gold, through blood, or through terror. And so the palace waited. Its walls, heavy with secrets, leaned closer. Its corridors, slick with decadence, listened. Outside, the empire sang of glory, but inside, the song was different. Inside, the stage was being set, not for celebration, but for a reckoning. For when a ruler feasts on his people, there comes a night when the feast turns rotten. The nights inside the palace grew longer, stretching like wounds that refused to close. Every evening, when the torches were lit and the curtains were drawn, the halls transformed into a place where cruelty dressed itself in silk. The emperor's hunger no longer hid in whispers. It strutted openly, carried on the backs of those he had enslaved, paraded before courtiers who laughed to disguise their fear. It began subtly, the way rot always begins. Servants of darker skin were ordered to serve not just food, but their very presence as spectacle. Their movements were watched, their bodies inspected like cattle at a market. The courtiers whispered about their exoticism, treating human life as ornamentation, a decoration to the emperor's ever-growing theatre of indulgence. What had once been service became entertainment, and what was entertainment soon became humiliation. The central figure, the one whose silence had not been submission, was among them. They were made to stand at the emperor's feasts, a living reminder of his reach, a trophy of conquest. Every detail of their being was twisted into a symbol of the empire's supremacy, their skin, their heritage, their strength, all reduced to something the emperor could display. Yet in their eyes lingered defiance, quiet but unbroken. And it was this that unsettled the emperor most. Night after night, the palace became more grotesque. Courtiers were invited to witness orchestrated spectacles in which the enslaved were forced into rituals that stripped them of dignity. Music played while chains rattled. Perfumed air mixed with the stench of sweat and blood. The line between pleasure and cruelty blurred until cruelty itself became the only pleasure. The city outside pretended not to see, but rumors spread faster than fire. Merchants whispered of nights where the emperor summoned dozens, only for silence to follow by morning. Families searched for loved ones who vanished into the palace and never returned. The empire's banners still flew proudly, yet beneath them, fear festered. The palace had become a graveyard disguised as a monument. For the enslaved, each day was survival beneath the weight of spectacle. Tasks grew harsher, punishments grew crueler, and always, the emperor's gaze lingered on the central figure, as though breaking them would be the ultimate proof of power. He staged scenarios designed to crush spirit, forcing them to kneel for hours, to carry burdens meant to shame, to endure jeers from courtiers who delighted in their suffering. But still, the defiance in their eyes did not dim. That defiance was dangerous. It inspired whispers among the others in chains. In the darkest corners, they began to remember they were not just victims, but people who once belonged to rivers, mountains, villages, people who had names before the palace tried to erase them. Each stolen glance, each shared memory became a spark the emperor could not see. But sparks, if left to grow, can set fire to empires. The emperor, blinded by indulgence, fed the very fire he feared. He escalated the orgies into rituals of domination, nights where entire wings of the palace were transformed into stages of cruelty. He demanded obedience not just from those enslaved, but from his courtiers, forcing them to participate in the degradation, binding them in guilt and silence. What was once private corruption had become public performance, a theatre of power in which the emperor alone was director. Yet in that theatre, cracks widened. Courtiers forced to watch began to carry the weight of what they had seen. Servants who escaped the palace carried stories into the city, and the enslaved themselves, though still shackled, carried inside them something the emperor could never own, the knowledge that cruelty, no matter how vast, cannot erase humanity. The palace itself seemed to groan under the weight of what it witnessed. Its golden halls no longer gleamed but seemed to absorb the screams, its marble floors stained by invisible blood. Every corner whispered with echoes. Every corridor trembled as if the building itself knew it was complicit in crimes too vast to remain hidden. And in the midst of it all, the central figure stood, unbroken in spirit, though scarred in body. Their presence became unbearable to the emperor because it revealed a truth he could not admit, that no matter how much power he held, some things could not be consumed. The stage was set for something inevitable. The orgies of power had grown, too grotesque, the whispers too loud, the defiance too visible. The empire that prided itself on glory now teetered on the edge of decay, and all who entered the palace could feel it, that sense of standing inside a place built not for life, but for collapse. The question was no longer if the collapse would come, but how. The night descended upon the palace like a shroud, heavy and suffocating, wrapping every stone and shadow in an atmosphere that promised horror. From the distant hills, the towering walls glimmered faintly, lit by 1,000 torches that sputtered in the wind. The world outside seemed asleep, unaware of the nightmare that prepared itself within. Yet those who lived close to the fortress knew better. They could sense it in the unnatural stillness of the air, in the way the ground seemed to pulse with the sound of drums that had begun hours before the gathering. It was the rhythm of command, the rhythm of fear, a pulse that every beating heart within the empire had come to recognize. Inside, the palace was alive in a way that was grotesque. Corridors usually reserved for silence or ceremony now swelled with noise. Boots slamming against the stone floors, courtiers whispering nervously to one another, the constant hiss of braziers being fed with fresh oil to keep the flames high. Servants darted like shadows, carrying trays that overflowed with food and chalices of wine, though everyone knew that hunger tonight would not be for nourishment. The emperor had summoned them all for his great spectacle, and when the emperor summoned, the world obeyed. The grand hall itself had been transformed beyond recognition. What once was a chamber of council and diplomacy now resembled a theatre of nightmares. Heavy crimson draperies covered the walls, the colour of spilled blood made permanent, and tall columns wrapped in gilded snakes loomed over the crowd, as though mocking the humanity of those gathered. At the centre rose a dais, wide and circular, designed not for celebration, but for humiliation. Around it, long tables groaned under the weight of delicacies, roasted animals, fruits drenched in honey, goblets filled with crimson wine, but they remained untouched, as though the guests knew that to eat would be to betray their own trembling stomachs. The emperor appeared as the music began, each note shrill, designed not to please but to pierce. His figure, robed in gold so heavy it dragged slightly as he walked, glistened under the hundreds of flames. His crown reflected fire with every step, and his eyes burned brighter still, alive with anticipation. His presence was suffocating. Silence followed him like a cloak. Even the courtiers who had been whispering seconds earlier bowed their heads quickly, pretending reverence when in truth it was terror that bent their necks. With a gesture of his hand, the first act of the spectacle began. Chains rattled like discordant bells, announcing the arrival of those dragged into the hall. The enslaved shuffled forward, their bodies gaunt from labor, their skin marred with scars that bore witness to years of cruelty. Their eyes were empty, or forced to be, trained to look down, to never meet the gaze of those who claimed to own them. Tonight, however, they were not mere workers. Tonight, they were to be made into entertainment, molded into the emperor's twisted idea of performance. They were arranged in a circle around the dais, commanded to dance. The music quickened, shrieking notes from violins, pounding drums, the sharp beat of flutes. But this was no joyous dance. It was the mockery of rhythm, bodies forced into contorted movements, limbs jerking awkwardly under the lash of whips that cracked if anyone faltered. The courtiers clapped mechanically, their faces stiff, their palms striking each other more in fear than celebration. The sound echoed through the hall, hollow and lifeless. Then the central figure was brought forth. Unlike the others, this one carried a presence that refused to vanish into the crowd. Their body bore the same marks of torment, their frame bent from the endless burden of chains, yet there was something unbroken in the eyes that lifted, steady and defiant, even under the weight of 100 stairs. Where others bowed, this figure stood as tall as the chains allowed, and in that refusal to yield, a spark flickered in the darkness. The emperor saw it instantly. His smile tightened, thin as a blade. He leaned forward on his throne, watching with the hunger of a beast that had cornered prey. For him, defiance was not a challenge, but an invitation, an opportunity to break what dared to resist. With a flick of his wrist, he commanded the central figure to be dragged onto the dais, the platform that awaited them like an altar. The hall grew still. Even the courtiers sensed that what was to come would be unlike the rest. The chains clattered against stone as the figure was forced to kneel. But kneeling was not enough. Servants piled burdens upon their back, sacks of grain stolen from distant provinces, slabs of stone that had been pulled from the very foundations of the palace, symbols of the empire's weight. The body trembled, muscles straining, but still, it did not collapse. Whips lashed across their back, each strike echoing like thunder, splitting flesh and leaving trails of blood. The courtiers clapped again, louder this time, though their eyes betrayed their unease. Still the eyes did not bow. Every lash was endured in silence. Every added weight was carried with trembling but unbroken will. The emperor demanded screams, demanded submission, but what he received was endurance. The silence of the figure became a defiance louder than any cry, a mirror reflecting the emptiness of his cruelty. The emperor's rage deepened. He ordered more. The branding irons were brought forth, their tips glowing red with fire. The air filled with the stench of burning flesh as marks were pressed into skin, scars layered upon scars, each one meant to erase identity, to reduce a person into property. The courtiers forced themselves to laugh louder, but the sound cracked, brittle and strained, for what they witnessed was not a spectacle, but a revelation. Cruelty could wound, but it could not erase the soul that refused to bend. And still the silence endured. The hall began to suffocate under it. Courtiers who had once thrived in the spectacle now shifted uneasily. Servants trembled as they poured wine no one touched. Even the musicians faltered, their instruments quivering in their hands, notes stumbling as though they too wished to stop. The emperor demanded the music rise, demanded laughter, demanded participation, and so the courtiers complied, stepping forward one by one to play their roles in the ritual of degradation. Their faces were pale, their hands shook, but still they obeyed, because to refuse was to perish. The dais became a theatre of shame. Every act inflicted upon the central figure was meant to crush. Yet with every moment, it was the courtiers themselves who crumbled inside. They were not masters of cruelty, but prisoners of fear. forced to join in rituals that tore pieces from their souls. At the center of it all, the figure remained, bloodied, branded, beaten, yet unbroken in spirit. Their silence had become louder than screams, an echo that no lash, no flame, no weight could extinguish. And in that silence, the Emperor's power began to unravel, thread by thread, though none dared say it aloud. The palace itself seemed to bear witness. The walls absorbed every lash, every silence, every broken laugh. Shadows writhed across, the crimson draperies as if alive, as though the building itself recoiled from what it housed. And above it all, the torches sputtered, their flames bending and twisting as if even fire wished to flee. The Emperor, blinded by fury, could not see it. He only saw the silence as an insult, a challenge that demanded greater cruelty. He rose from his throne, descending toward the dais like a predator approaching prey. The music screeched higher, drums pounding faster, as if the heart of the palace itself were racing. The courtiers leaned forward, torn between horror and compulsion, knowing they could not look away. The final act had only just begun. The Emperor's steps thundered against the marble of the dais, each one a command, each one a declaration that the hall itself belonged to him. The golden robes trailed behind, him brushing across the blood that had pooled upon the stone, staining fabric that was meant to signify purity and power. He did not care. To him, the stains were trophies, proof of dominion, a reminder that nothing within these walls could escape his will. His eyes locked upon the central figure, the one who had denied him the satisfaction of a scream, and in that gaze burned a rage that eclipsed reason. He lifted his hand, and servants scurried forward, carrying instruments not of music, but of torment. Iron hooks, polished and sharp. Chains tipped with spiked weights. Whips knotted with shards of glass that caught the light and glimmered with promise of deeper wounds. The courtiers gasped quietly, but they masked it instantly with applause, their palms striking together in hollow rhythm, as though noise could drown out conscience. The Emperor basked in it, mistaking fear for adoration. The figure was forced onto their feet, though their body trembled from exhaustion. The chains around their wrists dragged against the dais, ringing with a metallic chime that echoed through the chamber like a funeral bell. They were suspended by ropes that tightened cruelly, pulling arms above the head, stretching joints to the brink of tearing. Yet the eyes remained steady, unwavering, refusing to collapse into despair. The first blow of the glass-laced whip tore across flesh. Blood sprayed against the polished stone, droplets catching the torchlight like rubies, scattered in the air. Another blow followed, then another, each accompanied by the hollow applause of the court, by laughter that shook but did not stop, for stopping meant death. The Emperor demanded the rhythm be maintained, and so the courtiers clapped and laughed, in unison, turning cruelty into ritual, turning torture into theatre. But the silence endured. The figure did not scream. Their body convulsed under the pain, their skin ripped and shredded until it was a tapestry of agony, yet still no sound of surrender escaped their lips. Their silence thundered louder than the drums, louder than the laughter, louder than the Emperor's roars. It filled the hall like a storm, suffocating those who partook in the ritual. For in that silence, every spectator saw their own reflection, their cowardice, their complicity, their broken humanity. The Emperor could not bear it. His fury twisted into mania. He seized one of the branding irons himself, lifting it high so the flames glowed against his face, warping his features into a grotesque mask. He pressed the iron against the figure's chest. The stench of searing flesh choked the hall, smoke curling upward in tendrils that clung to the draperies. The courtiers gagged behind their hands, but quickly turned the sound into forced laughter, as though to convince themselves this was entertainment. The figure's body jerked violently, but the silence persisted. That silence became rebellion. The Emperor staggered back, momentarily shaken, as though he had glimpsed his own weakness reflected in those eyes. He roared, demanding music louder. demanding dancing, demanding the enslaved around the dais continue their grotesque performance. Musicians played until strings snapped, until their fingers bled, drums beaten until skins split and sticks broke. The sound filled the hall, but none of it could drown out the silence of the central figure. The palace itself seemed to resist. The torches flickered violently, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the blood-stained floor. The columns groaned as though burdened by the weight of centuries of cruelty. The crimson draperies rippled without wind, as if recoiling from the stench of burning flesh and the echo of defiance. The walls absorbed the silence, amplifying it, carrying it into the marrow of everyone present. Courtiers began to falter. Their claps slowed, their laughter fractured into nervous stutters. They shifted in their seats, faces pale, sweat dripping down foreheads despite the cold of night. Some bit their lips until blood welled, struggling not to cry out. They had become part of the ritual unwillingly, slaves to fear, and the silence of the figure was forcing them to confront what they had become. Monsters not by choice, but by obedience. Still, none dared to stop. The emperor raised his arms, high, his voice booming with manic triumph, declaring himself master of bodies, master of spirits, master of silence. He commanded the enslaved dancers to collapse upon the floor, to crawl like animals at his feet, their hands scraping against, stone until skin split. He demanded the courtiers rise from their seats and join in the grotesque spectacle, to stamp their feet and chant praises. One by one, they obeyed, their voices rising in trembling unison, the words of devotion to a ruler who had devoured their humanity. And at the center of it all, the figure hung suspended, battered and bloodied, yet unbroken. The silence endured. It had become a force greater than the emperor's cruelty, greater than the courtiers' fear. It was a silence that spoke of something beyond survival, beyond suffering, the refusal to be erased. The emperor struck again and again, each act of cruelty more frenzied than the last. Yet the more he inflicted, the more powerless he became, for each wound was transformed into a symbol of endurance. His power fed upon submission, but here submission was denied. What remained was rage without victory, dominance without satisfaction, cruelty without triumph. The hall itself seemed to tremble. The torches sputtered, shadows convulsed, the music faltered, as instruments snapped under the force of terrified hands. The emperor screamed, his voice breaking into animalistic growls, a ruler unraveling before his own court. Yet still the silence stood unbroken, a monument of defiance that no blade, no fire, no chain could extinguish. And in that moment, though, none dared to speak it aloud. A shift occurred. The emperor was no longer the master of the hall. The silence was. The night deepened, and still the chamber reeked of blood, smoke, and fear. The torches burned lower, their flames twitching as though suffocated by the weight of silence that no music, no chanting, no forced applause could dispel. The emperor stood trembling, his golden robes heavy with sweat and stains, his crown, crooked, upon his head. The rage that had fueled him was beginning to turn inward, consuming him from the inside. He had demanded screams, demanded surrender, demanded the humiliation of a soul before him. Yet all he had received was defiance carved into silence. He staggered closer to the figure, his breath ragged, his hands shaking though he tried to mask them with theatrical gestures. He raised a dagger, small but gleaming, the kind reserved for sacrifice rather than battle. Its blade caught the faint light, reflecting not triumph but desperation. He pressed it against the figure's side, pushing slowly, watching as blood welled in fresh streams. The body convulsed, but still no scream came. No voice broke the chamber. The silence grew unbearable, pressing against the emperor's ears until it roared louder than thunder. The courtiers were breaking. Some covered their eyes, their bodies rocking with the effort to hold back sobs. Others stared blankly ahead, faces drained of all color, like masks carved from stone. A few clapped still, weakly, their hands trembling, the sound feeble and scattered. It no longer resembled applause. It was the hollow rattle of prisoners shackled to ritual, and in their hearts, though none dared whisper it, a single truth settled. The emperor had lost. For what is power if not recognized? What is dominion if not affirmed by the submission of the ruled? The figure, bloodied and broken yet unyielding, had denied him both. His cruelty had devoured flesh but not spirit. He had proven his body could wound, but not command. And in that denial, the emperor was stripped bare, revealed not as a god, but as a man gnawed by fear. Desperate, he turned upon the others. His finger shot toward the dancers, the musicians, the enslaved pressed against the walls. He screamed for more performance, more devotion, more proof that his throne still ruled their souls. The dancers stumbled forward on bleeding knees, collapsing in grotesque shapes upon the floor. Musicians struck broken instruments until only discordant shrieks echoed. Yet none of it pleased him, for none of it silenced the defiance that loomed. At the hall's center, the palace itself seemed to revolt. The marble cracked where blood had seeped too deep, dark lines crawling like veins across the floor. The crimson draperies sagged heavy with smoke, their colors darkened to black. The gilded statues stared down with blank eyes, their golden sheen now resembling jaundiced flesh. The very air grew heavy, each breath laced with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid burn of charred skin. The hall had transformed into a mausoleum, a place not of glory, but of damnation. The emperor lashed out, striking courtiers who faltered in their obedience. He struck one across the face with his scepter, teeth scattering across the floor like pearls. Another he shoved to their knees, forcing their head to the ground beneath his heel, demanding they kiss the stone slick with blood. Terror forced compliance, but their devotion rang hollow. Every act of obedience now carried the weight of mockery, for none could erase the truth etched in silence. At last, trembling and drenched in sweat, the emperor turned back to the figure. His eyes were wild, rimmed with red, his crown slipping further until it clattered to the dais. He screamed a final command, a demand for the silence to be broken. But no sound came. The figure's eyes, half-lidded with exhaustion yet unwavering, delivered a final blow without moving. The unspoken truth that his empire of cruelty was powerless against endurance. Something in the emperor cracked then. His scream turned into a sob, though he tried to disguise it with fury. He stabbed again and again, his blade plunging into already broken flesh, until his own arms shook with fatigue. Blood drenched him, soaking into his robes, dripping from his hands. He looked less like a ruler than a butcher lost in madness, a man swallowed by the very darkness he had unleashed. And still, the silence endured. The figure's body, finally, went limp, but even in death no sound of surrender escaped. The silence had triumphed, outliving flesh, outlasting cruelty. It clung to the walls, seeped into the stone, settled into the marrow of every witness. It was a silence that would never leave, a silence that condemned all who had seen and all who had obeyed. The emperor stumbled back, dropping the dagger. His chest heaved, his eyes darting wildly, but no victory filled them. Around him, courtiers stared with hollow eyes. Enslaved bodies slumped in heaps of exhaustion and despair. No applause rose. No chants of devotion echoed. Only silence remained, vast and suffocating, drowning the hall in its grip. And so the climax ended, not with triumph, not with music, not with submission, but with silence. A silence more powerful than screams, more enduring than crowns, more immortal than the man who sought to be worshipped. The emperor had won nothing. The figure, in their refusal to break, had become eternal. When dawn finally crept across the empire, it did not rise with celebration. The palace, so often loud with music and false joy, lay heavy in silence. Its marble floors were still damp with what had been spilled the night before, its walls swollen with echoes that could not be erased. Servants moved quietly, avoiding one another's eyes, as though acknowledging what had been done might make it real. The emperor remained on his throne, but something had changed. His crown still glittered, his robe still shimmered, yet the weight of his performance lingered not as triumph but as rot. For all his cruelty, he had failed to achieve the one thing he desired most: complete submission. The central figure, though battered and broken, had refused him the satisfaction of surrender, and in that refusal, the emperor's power was exposed for what it truly was: fragile, desperate, hollow. The courtiers returned to their estates carrying invisible scars. Outwardly, they still bowed, still praised, still echoed the lies of the empire. But inwardly, they could not unsee the truth, that the empire's glory was nothing more than a theatre built on bones. Some drowned their shame in excess, others silenced it with loyalty, but all of them carried the memory of defiance that no cruelty could erase. For the enslaved, the aftermath was both devastation and awakening. Many could no longer walk, many could no longer hope, yet in whispered breaths, in stolen glances, they shared the image of the figure who had stood unbroken. Before the emperor, that image spread like a secret hymn, a reminder that they were not simply tools, not merely shadows, but human, and that humanity, once remembered, cannot be entirely destroyed. Outside the palace walls, the city stirred with unease. Rumors traveled through markets and alleyways, stories of nights filled with music and screams, of vanished lives, of a ruler whose hunger had no end. The empire's banner still flew above the gates, but beneath it, fear deepened into doubt. For every whisper of glory, there were 10 whispers of corruption. For every tale of power, there was a darker tale of shame. The palace itself seemed to change. Once a monument to wealth, it now stood as a mausoleum of guilt. Its gardens bloomed less brightly. Its fountains gurgled like choked throats. Visitors spoke of cold draughts in warm halls, of walls that seemed to weep when no one watched. A place once built to celebrate life had become a prison of memory, each stone soaked in suffering. And the emperor, he continued his indulgence, unable to stop, unable to admit defeat. But his orgies no longer dazzled. They repelled. They became rituals not of domination, but of decay. His attempts to display power revealed only his terror of losing it. The more he consumed, the emptier he became, until his image was no longer that of a ruler, but of a man devoured by his own hunger. History would remember him not as a leader, not as a builder of empires, but as the emperor who turned his palace into an orgy of cruelty and shame. His name would rot, his monuments crumble, but the memory of those who suffered and those who resisted in silence would remain. For the true legacy of an empire is not carved in stone, but in the scars it leaves on the people it tried to erase. And so the story ends not with victory, but with a question. How many more empires must rise and fall before humanity learns that power built on the destruction of others is no power at all?